buy the DVD.
Cool.
So I sell the DVD thing, and I'd stream it on. And if I had somebody, an employee, I would, which I used to have. But I'll email you. So I'll probably be that Monday week.
Okay.
9:30, every Monday evening on Triangle.
All right, Alan.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
And then I get lots of requests. Oh, I only came in halfway through, and people buy the DVD.
Cool.
So I sell the DVD thing, and I'd stream it on. And if I had somebody, an employee, I would, which I used to have, it would all be streamed. I've got it all there, but it's a lot of time and work to put the program on there.
Well, sign me up for a copy of the DVD.
Oh, I'll send you a copy.
Thank you.
Just out of appreciation. Tom Rudiger, you're a practicing psychiatrist here in Auckland, and I've come to you because I've been told by a friend of mine who's worked with you that you're prepared to talk honestly and freely without too many constraints of the correct way to refer to it, or the textbook model or whatever, and I think that's very important. I know that, we've just been talking, you've explained that one of the big swings has been since the beginning of the 20th century, when Freud and Jung and others opened up psychiatry to the inside of people's heads, to the environment that they'd been in, etc. And subsequent to that, 100 years later, that tends to be, with the power of chemistry and biology, that there's a swing, especially with the money that's involved, there's a swing back to drugs and a chemical solution to psychological problem. Now, I'd like to start there because I think I have a leaning towards psychiatry and psychology being a tool in the hands of the individual as well as the doctor. And people don't feel disempowered by chemicals and external solutions, but empowered by answers that make sense to them, and that they can have some effect on their own psyche, and to some extent bring themselves to health. And that is the particular bent I'm interested in, and I'd like your comment as to where you stand on that particular spectrum.
Thank you, Alan. I just want to start by thanking you for the opportunity to talk about the ideas that you raise, because I think at the moment in the world there is a kind of international tension around the concepts of mental illness, the diagnostic criteria that we use, and probably most importantly, the sense of what causes mental illness, what goes wrong in people's minds that create the symptoms that we regard as, that we label as psychotic or depressed or manic, for example. And here in Auckland, I think there is a strong tendency in the psychiatric community to resort to genetic explanations for mental disorder, serious mental disorder, and to look to psychopharmacology for solution to the problems. And I must say, antipsychotic medicines, mood stabilizing medicines, and anti-anxiety medicines are very effective. They do often relieve the symptoms of someone who's suffering from auditory hallucinations or unstable mood, but they do so, as you've alluded to it, at some cost. First, there are the obvious things like side effects, and secondly, it takes the solution to the problem as something that resides outside the individual, and it suggests that they're kind of helpless in the face of an illness, and that the doctor provides the solution, which they then comply with. And I think it is disempowering often, and I think it doesn't feel collaborative often, and so people are left feeling kind of at the mercy of medicine, and when things don't go well, which they often don't, they feel resentful, and so doctors and patients are offside with each other, and I think that's the kind of tradition, at least in the second half of the 20th century, after we discovered that chemicals could really make a difference. I have become, over the last decade, steadily more aware of the prevalence of trauma in the lives of the people whom I meet that have serious mental illness. the trauma takes the form often of first childhood, physical and sexual abuse, neglect, or more subtly, a failure of the attachment process between the newborn child, the young child, and parents. And this causes what I have found to be a derailment in emotional development. We tend to be born in kind of discrete behavioral states. You know, the infant shifts from one state to another rather abruptly, and there's no sort of overview held by the individual when they're 1, 2, 3 years old. And what we develop in a safe enough environment is a sense of ourselves. We begin to understand that we have different feelings at different times, and we begin to appreciate the spectrum is all me. You know, I'm not just this angry person or this sad person. I move from one state to another, and we develop what we call integration, psychic integration over time. And I believe that people who are traumatized to various degrees when they're children get some derailment, experience some derailment in that integration process, and they're left somewhat, the term is dissociative, but kind of disjointed, fragmented. And so that instead of operating as a kind of consistent self, they operate in ways that are much more shifting and unpredictable. And I believe, for example, the classic example I think is someone who hears voices. Now, in our current nosology, if someone hears voices, they are called psychotic, which is sort of one of the definitions of psychosis. That's fair enough. But then very quickly are assigned a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is considered the disorder that's characterized by hallucinations or delusions, or very, very disorganized thinking. Those are the three big things. Well, when I think about hearing a voice, unless I accept the fact that the patient is right when they think it's a demon or it's being beamed in from some external source, again, the locus of control being outside the person, I'm convinced that a voice is a part of the person's mind that is communicating with the person without their really appreciating the connection. So this is as dissociative a process as you can imagine. Now voices are not considered dissociative symptoms. They're considered psychotic symptoms. They go into these psychotic disorders in DSM-4. There is a section of dissociative disorders and post-traumatic disorders, for example, but voices are not considered prominent there. So it occurred to me when the most probably the most disturbing symptom in people who suffer from mental illness, hallucinations and delusional thinking, are regarded as biological problems and not the product of a developmental derailment. We're gonna wind up getting in trouble. We're gonna wind up focusing our attention too much on biochemistry and not enough on an historical perspective and a way of helping them understand the process going on in their own mind.
Your thinking is, which by the way I highly agree with, is that people are a group. They're not an individual in that sense in their head. They're a group, and that group is pretty heterogeneous. And the trick, I suppose, of sanity is realize what, as far as I know what you said, is to bring that group together and say, well, that's all me, and even the bits I don't particularly like are still me. And the chances of that happening are pretty small if your upbringing is pretty dysfunctional. Now, do we agree on that sort of a bit of a concept?
Yes, it sounded good.
Now, for people out there watching, what are the sort of things that really break this group up at an early age so that people can sort of see, well, that could have happened to me, or I don't want to do that. So empower us with the knowledge of what not to do and what isn't good to have done to you.
Okay, even that, the appreciation of what sorts of things derail a child's development are still emerging. First of all, let me say that I don't believe every child that's born is the same. It's not a blank slate on which we impose our will. Everybody has, I think, a different set of propensities, of different levels of exploratory tendencies and different sensitivities. And so it's, the child is born a communicator. I think the important first step is to have someone there who appreciates the child's communication and responds in ways that are consistent, appropriate, and safe. So the child begins to learn the impact of his or her actions on the world, and begins to feel like, oh, I've got some power here. You know, I can manipulate. Oh, that didn't work. That didn't bring about what I wanted. Let me try something else. And they begin over time to learn that they have a lot of power. They can control their own environment. There are limits to what they can do. There are expectations around them, and they slowly begin to kind of take their innate propensities and mold them to the environment in which they are developing. If that environment is unstable, if the child never gets consistent feedback about what's happening, or never gets feedback at all because of neglect, or because the parent is disorganized or unavailable for some reason of their own, the child just doesn't get the information necessary, then he or she can't establish a consistent pattern of behavior, a consistent sense of themselves as actors in the world. If a child is outright abused, then the moments of abuse create incredible fear and anger, and the child can't a small child can't turn to a caregiver and go, I've decided I'm going to get a lawyer, or I've decided I'm going to move out. This is not an acceptable environment. They must make it work. And so children often put away the fear, put away the anger, sequester it, wall it off, and manage to present to the parents a good child, a child that wants to please. So in fact they preserve their own life because the caregivers continue then to stay. But that means, I think, that those parts of them, those memories, those fears, those emotions get fragmented. That's the kind of thing that interrupts the development of the integrative process over time. So I would say that the best defense against the persistence of dissociative states and the emergence, I think, of trauma-related symptoms is to provide a consistent nurturing environment for a child where they are not placed in fear and where they're not their needs are not ignored. Now that's easy to say, but those of us who have been through this process, both as children and as parents, and know how incredibly difficult it is to get consistent parenting if you're a kid, or to give consistent parenting if you're an overwrought a parent not getting any sleep and having financial problems and other kids to worry about. And fortunately, I think most of us are quite resilient. It is interesting that some children who seem to be in a good enough environment still wind up having significant emotional problems as adults. And some people who go through horrendous conditions as children still manage to hold things together and present to the world as fairly intact. Often what we find is that the people who are apparently intact, when in early adulthood they experience a serious loss, a breakup of a relationship, death of a loved one, they wind up having this inexplicable and acute decompensation, which gets misinterpreted, I think, as an acute psychotic episode, and they're put on medication, and the episode resolves, and the medication is given credit, and now later on when they stop the medication and something else traumatic happens, it's because they stopped the medication, not because they're vulnerable to these traumatic life events. So when you see causation in a person's history, then you see the solutions to the problem as exploring the history and helping someone to understand how their mind might have been structured as a consequence of those events in their life, and that gives them the invitation to say, well, hold it a second. I like to think of it as, I have an opportunity to be my own parent. When I was little, my parents didn't do X, and so I've got this persistent feeling, for example, that I'm not a good person, or this persistent fear that comes up in certain situations. All right, well, let me think about that. When I start feeling that fear, let me talk to myself, Let me try and hold the sense of myself as a mature and competent and worthwhile adult, and help that part of me that is damaged, that has been hurt, to sort of develop. It couldn't develop before, but it's not too late. So that notion of being your own, it sounds a little hokey, and I hate to put it this way, but sort of being your own parent, when, as an adult, looking back at the developmental sort of these pools of pain or anger that have remained behind as you developed, to sort of explore those and incorporate them into who you are as an adult. This process is, I think, what the essence of therapy is for almost everyone. There are some people who have had extreme trauma, who have what is called a dissociative identity disorder, where there's so much sequestering of these different parts of the psyche that they in fact switch from one to the other with very little continuity between them. I'm not talking about that as the mainstream product. That is, of course, a very difficult psychological situation to resolve. And fortunately, many of the people who have DID do quite well, thank you. Every now and then they have, under a lot of stress, they may have difficulty, but they do. It's quite a remarkable set of people that I've come to know with DID. No, for most of us, it's much more subtle. It's a vulnerability. I'll be a bit self-disclosing in my case. I've always been very longing for approval. I've done things and then looked around for someone to tell me that I'm okay, and that has often gotten me in trouble, because instead of sort of providing myself with verification of my own merit, I'm looking for it in other people, and I regarded that as a product of my developmental history. It makes perfect sense now that I've explored what my mother and father were like and the struggles that they had and how they related to me, gee, I hope you approve of this. Needless to say, I haven't completely overcome the tendency, but let me just say that I think I'm far better able to sort of be my own judge than I have been in the past, and that's been a process of self-exploration. I think that's what we ought to be doing more of. I think medications are incredibly powerful, and I think they're useful, and I probably prescribe more medicine than, well, as much as anybody else in the city, and I think it's sometimes necessary for stabilization, but it's not the solution to the problem. Even people who are very clearly diagnosed with schizophrenia, who meet all the criteria, people who are manic, people who are incredibly depressed, they are still there, and they are still reachable, and they can still be their own parent in a very real sense, I think.
Well, first I'd like to say that I think that's to your credit that, as you said, you'd be a bit self-disclosing. I can't see how a psychiatrist or a psychologist can possibly help somebody if they don't have some understanding of what the person's going through, and how can they have that understanding except by having gone through it to some extent or other themselves.
Sure.
And of course we're all human, so we all do go through it. It's just a matter of accepting that fact. And to me, the big leap forward in psychiatry and psychology, and for each individual, whether they're not as a professional, for an individual and the psychiatrist, is to accept that they have all these bits in there, and some of them are, hokey, as you call it, and some of them are childlike. I won't call them childish, but childlike. Mm-hmm. And some of those childlike bits are the very parts that they might have to address, because that's the most vulnerable time in your life. And if you're brought up in the 40s, 50s, it's almost certain you'll be stuffed, because I'd just like to say that because the environment that people used to be brought up in, was so un-PC that it's amazing how we got through it. And can I just address that this attachment thing? I mean, back in the 50s, the English heritage, the 50s, the 60s, the post-war environment, the 60s stuff, people were so unwarm and so towards their kids in general. It was all just mechanical. And how did we? Doesn't that scar a whole generation or something like that?
I couldn't agree with you more. I just think about my father lying about his age and going off to the Pacific to fight World War II at 17. My mother waiting behind for him. That he gets back, and within weeks they're married, and within a couple of months she's pregnant, and then 15 months later I'm born, and she's general anesthesia and high forceps and bottles instead of breasts, and sorry. Yes, I mean I think that the trauma that they went through, the environment where they didn't know, whether they were going to survive it, and then they're so young and have children so quickly, and the the culture of the time, which was, as you say, quite mechanical. Quite, we've got technology now. We can deliver babies without a mother's help.
Yes.
We can feed a baby without a mother's breast. Haven't we done well? And I think that is a setup for trouble. And obviously, there are an awful lot of my generation who don't. Well, I'm not so sure there are an awful lot of my generation who don't have issues that arise out of that. You're right, though, that most people get by. I think often I regard the work that I've done on my own psyche as improving the quality of my life. Had I never done that, I think I still would have gotten through my life okay, been reasonably successful, raised children. But I don't think I would have appreciated these kinds of issues if I hadn't engaged in self-exploration. And so that is what I think everyone should be doing. Not necessarily plunking down $100 an hour with a therapist, but really kind of curious about their own makeup, and why did I just do that? I told myself I wasn't going to do that. Now here I am doing it. Why am I so inconsistent? There are parts of me here that don't agree. Let's explore what that means. That kind of thing can really bear fruit.
Well, that's great that you raised that issue of quality of life, because I think that's what it's all about. We've been told that quality of life basically is this house, car, security, meaning security of your material assets, not a secure psyche. And I think if there's any revolution that's sort of taken place, it's not the the scientific revolution, and before that the industrial revolution. Yes, they were revolutions, but the real revolution, if we're going to survive as a species, has to be a revolution within the psyche as to what real quality of life is. And that involves some sort of, or a lot of understanding of our own psyche, a lot of integration, as you said, of all of those parts that heretofore have been labelled. For instance, the Bible and all the religions label huge chunks of our psyche as evil, bad, and unadmissible, etc. So, we've got to get through that, or else these people who do that, like President Bush, if his psyche is allowed to dictate how the world's going to run, well, we're stuffed. So we need a revolution in the psyche, and that's about quality of life, and that's about understanding those bits. Now, how can we do that? How can somebody start doing that? You said, why did I do that? I said I wouldn't do it, but I did it. So that's the beginning, is it, of starting to look at yourself?
Yeah, I think Freud liked to look at slips of the tongue and sort of faux pas that people would do, and I think he had the right idea. We find ourselves thinking and feeling one plan and performing a plan that often is dramatically different. Telling ourselves, well, the obvious addictive behaviors are the obvious ones. I'm not going to do that anymore. It's clear it's not good for me. I'm not going to gamble. I'm not going to drink. Whatever. I'm not going to be promiscuous. Whatever your particular addiction of choice. Say, I'm just not going to do it anymore. It's bad for me. I'm hurting people. I'm hurting my life. And next thing you know, you're walking into Sky City. Or you're walking into the bottle shop and you go, well, hold it. Why am I doing this? Clearly, there's a part of you that needs that. That is solving some problem with a self-induced chemical change. And so it's what my wife Susie Farrelly, who's also a psychiatrist here in Auckland, talks about the concept of emotional avoidance. That we do when we start to feel anxiety about something, when we start to feel a situation that causes us distress because of our own unique vulnerabilities, we blunt that process, often by engaging in some distraction, often a distraction that's destructive. That takes away the anxiety, that takes away our impetus to sort out the problem. So I think whenever we find ourselves doing something that is potentially destructive, that certainly is at 90 degrees to the flow of our thinking at the moment, we have to ask why. What just happened to me? It involves there's a therapist in the United States who's developed something called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a horrible name, but basically it's about the first step in it is mindfulness, where you just sort of observe and describe your own thoughts and feelings. What am I feeling, and all of a sudden suddenly I'm feeling angry. What just happened? You know, you often go, people say, it just came over me. You know, I just, you know, the devil made me do it, whatever.
Yeah.
But that is often the result of missing a step, not observing your own internal process. And you go, gee, when the phone rang, you know, I suddenly got this wave of anxiety, and then I got angry, and I realized, although the call wasn't for me, I was expecting to hear from my mother, and she hasn't called, and you know, I knew she really didn't care. I mean, there's an infinite number of tiny things that can happen in your daily life that trigger reminiscences and vulnerabilities that if you don't stop and think about it, you just ride right through them and gain nothing from the experience.
Yeah.
So I think every emotional event is potentially an opportunity to understand more about what makes you tick. Learn your triggers, learn the ways that you respond to those triggers, things you might do differently. So you begin to build a repertoire of responses to stressors that you didn't even know you had before until you first became mindful. So I think probably mindfulness is at the beginning of that process of learning the ways in which you avoid strong feelings and adjusting.
You know, corporates have cottoned on to, you know, EQ, emotional, or EIQ, emotional emotional quotient instead of intellectual quotient or intelligence quotient. And they're starting to use, you know, like everything, exploit emotions now. You know, some people are smart at emotions. What they're really saying is they know how to manipulate those people through their emotions. That's not a revolution in understanding or quality of life. That's just how to keep this group of people together so we can keep the machine running. What I'd like to get back to is the personal use of your own emotions for your own quality of life is, first step is you've got to recognise that you are having an emotion.
That's right.
Rather than just being the emotion. You've got to you've got to get some sort of dissociation, with a good dissociation from that emotion, from that side of you, and look at it from somewhere over here in your psyche and say, well, that part's having an emotion. Yeah. Now, how can you do this? How do you get to that?
Now, I think that some of us do it better than others, and some of us do it. I might do it better at work than I do at home, or vice versa. You know, the context determines how observant you can be. I do think that self-observation is a skill that we can develop, and what some people do is they keep diaries of DBT has a lot of things called diary cards where you have to map each day how many times did you feel X, and it not that the diary card per se is necessary, but it's a vehicle which gets the person to think in terms to attend to emotions that they've experienced. And so if you have a feeling and then you can attend to it, I mean that you're well on the way then. Yeah. But just having a feeling, we are constantly having to deal with people who have a strong feeling, and then in response to that feeling, they hurt themselves, they do something impulsive, they punch somebody, they run away, and that's the point. Somewhere between the feeling and the action, which is a product of the feeling, either a way of negating the feeling or a way of avoiding the implications of the feeling. As soon as you perform an action that isn't one that you're entirely happy with, that's the moment when you can look back and say what feeling generated it, and then what generated that feeling. That can be the place where you start, where something bad, you do something that you're not happy with. That to me is because nobody likes that. Everyone's aware of that event. Yeah. What was I feeling when I did that, and what made me feel that way? And the better, and when you've done it a few times, you begin to get more and more adroit. Yeah. And before you know it, you're aware of the feeling before you've acted, and you can begin to impose a different path, behavioral path.
Would that be like meditation? When you said that, it's a skill. I immediately thought, well, the most well-known, widespread skill, practical skill, to develop some form of empowerment within your own psyche would be meditation. Is that right? Meditation can start to get you looking at your mind. I mean, that's what they always, isn't it? Meditation
is a kind of mindfulness. Yes, it's a very powerful way of being mindful. We in DBT training, we learned about mindfulness techniques that we can practice. It's a lot like there's lots of different visualizations you can do, or just the very simplest one. let's see if we can't get entirely focused on your on the workings of your body. Focus on your breath. You know, those are the classic meditation techniques.
Yeah.
So the reason I want to kind of separate mindfulness exercises from meditation is some may hear meditation as a kind of airy-fairy Eastern thing, and it's not like that. It's just a matter of shifting your awareness from out there in the world to inside. Watch how your thoughts are scattered. Watch how you have a hell of a time sticking to one thing. You start to think about your breath, and before you know, you feel your breath going. They said, "Yeah, I had a cold last week, and I haven't picked up that medicine." And before you know it, you realize 5 minutes have gone by and you haven't paid attention to your breath. So you bring yourself back, and it's a real skill to develop that kind of discipline. And those are the kinds of tools that you can then use to really see what it is that gets in the way of you doing what it is you want to do.
So these, this bad rap that Easterners have got is very undeserved, because I think they have developed some empowering psychological skills, not just kung fu, but kung fu of the mind, where it's quite incredible power there. I don't know where China's going with that now. It seems to be gone completely off the rails, but hopefully it'll come back. But the thing is that we shouldn't put this down, no matter what other people say. Oh, that's just Eastern mumbo jumbo. We should realise that there are real tools there that can enhance our quality of life, and that we don't have to have enough money, $90 to go to a therapist once a week, for them to sort of somehow bring the mindfulness in from the outside. Because I think I wouldn't put therapy down for an instant, but I would hope that the therapist would slowly, they start out being the mindfulness for that person. What did you feel then? What did you feel? Right. That's a separate person doing what hopefully you will be able to do for yourself.
Exactly. It's as you said, you used the word empowering at the beginning of our talk, and I think that's exactly what's happening. A therapist can be, and I regard myself as a psychiatrist, walking alongside someone who's troubled, trying to help them identify how they got to this situation, both from remote events and recent events, what it might mean as far as their vulnerabilities are concerned, and what they might do next to start to teach themselves a different way. And we have, we're developing now hearing voices groups, where people actually come and talk about the content of their hallucinations and begin to understand, get comfortable living with them, understand how to deal with them, and I would argue ultimately find the place in their mind that is troubled, that is the source of the voice. Often it's derogatory or commanding or nasty in some way, and find that source of distress and look after it, validate it. The concept of self-validation. Don't judge yourself. Don't say, "Oh, I'm so stupid for that." Just I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying to meditate. I'm trying to be mindful, and my mind is distracted. I'm so stupid. No. You are human, and that's the way it's going to work. So just gently lead yourself back to the goal that you're trying to achieve, and realize it's going to be it's a process. It's going to take a while. So it's fun to spend some time with somebody helping them to get the hang of that. And then of course there's lots of groups that people can do if they need sort of ongoing support. But ultimately the task is an intrapsychic one. I agree with you completely.
Yes, well I say that because I'm human too, and I moved up to the bush near Puhua, and my first, it might have been 18 months there. It was unbelievably stressful. I didn't realise how different living in the bush is to living in a city. And at 3 o'clock in the morning you're confronted with yourself in the true sense of the word. You're confronted with yourself, and there's absolutely no distractions, there's nobody can help you, and that is terrible, but wonderful if you survive.
A real opportunity if you can manage it.
If you can manage, and luckily I did, and I really appreciate it now, but at the time it was terrible. But that brings me to another question. I think, for instance, that book that Dr. Jameson wrote about her own manic depression, and she was a doctor and it was in the field and manic depressive herself, so that was a particular insight. But she made the point that some people have said, well, they want to completely take away her manic depression and get her up moods down, her down moods up, so that she'll be even. And she said, I don't want that. because during the down moods I have some phenomenal insights, and during the up I have incredible energy and I can achieve amazing things. And I thought of all of those artists out there who did things that no mere mortal could do. I bet 90% of them were probably manic depressives or something like that. So I want to broach on the concept of normal. Is your job to bring in abnormal people come in and normal people go out? I mean, it's just not like that, is it?
No, I think defining normal, one of the things I enjoy doing with registrars when we sit together is trying to get them to describe to me what a healthy mind is like, and what does it mean when someone when someone becomes abnormal, and you come down to realizing there are some extreme things that everyone will agree are not okay, that show signs of some kind of abnormality, but by and large there's a real array of what we regard as a sort of range of ways that people think and feel. I would say though that the problem is are you having a life worth living? Are you getting what you want out of it? Or is something getting in the way of your independence and your autonomy and your sense of satisfaction and your relationships? And if there is, then there's a problem. There's something that has happened to you that's getting in your way, and so the self-exploration is probably worth it. But the goal is not to take someone that has fluctuating moods and make them into a kind of leveled out automaton, not at all. And unfortunately, the medication sometimes makes people feel that way, and so they don't take it.
Yeah.
And if medication is your only solution to an unstable mood, you're in trouble, because the instability, the mood may be fluctuating and may be unstable, but for the person involved, it's them. That's how they feel about themselves.
Yeah.
So learning to help someone harness their moods to in the service of their own recovery and their own quality of life is the trick. And sometimes the moods get so extreme. I mean, someone may get insights when they're depressed, but some people get so depressed they can't eat and drink and they can't move, and they're going to die.
Yes.
They're in trouble.
Yeah.
Some people get so manic that they take life-threatening risks and destroy relationships, and so they clearly need help. But inside those extremes is an incredible amount of, as you say, creativity and energy and insight into yourself and the human condition. Once you've gone through a few of those cycles, you begin to understand how other humans might be thinking and feeling in a given situation, because you've crossed the spectrum of emotional experience.
Yeah.
So I think people with unstable mood, whatever we call that, whether we call that bipolar affective disorder or whatever, people with moods that fluctuate have a lot of insight, a lot of wisdom to offer.
Yeah, and I just think that word should be banished. The word normal should be banished from our lexicon, because and what should be brought in is uniqueness but livability. We're all abnormal to some extent in some area. The thing is to accept that and integrate it into your life, and in crazy sort of way exploit it for more life.
I like being abnormal,
Yeah.
I mean, if normal, strictly speaking, is this 2 standard deviations from the mean of some trait. I like being on the edges of some traits, and many of my colleagues would regard me as on the edges of far too many traits. But the point is, it makes you. I don't want to be an average Joe. I like being a unique fellow, and look forward to sort of reveling in that. But I also have the responsibility to harness those parts of me, to be able to manage them in a way that doesn't hurt anybody or me, and maximizes the quality of my life. And I think that's everybody's individual quest. That's what I recommend as an individual quest, if you're looking for one.
What's that?
To know the ways in which you are unique and harness those qualities in the service of your own quality of life. It may mean that you wind up doing great things for the world. That's cool. But the great things for the world has to come through, I think, the process of knowing yourself and fulfilling yourself. And it's cool that a lot of us, in the process of doing that, wind up getting into fields that help other people. I think that's not an accident. I think we're sort of built to be social. If we can, if we can be satisfied within our own selves, we can be, quite remarkable in the things that we achieve.
So there you have the alchemy of the psyche, is to combine the personal, selfish me, knowing myself, but somehow that very individualism leads one out into society at the same time.
Yep. The people who withdraw from society, the people who either hurt others or avoid others, are people who have not, I think, come to understand their own vulnerabilities. And so they're protecting themselves in some way. But they could protect themselves, I think they could learn about themselves and to be their own kind of nurturer with some work, and then, therefore, be able to reach out and be more social and more, productive is the word we use, but I mean more fulfilled, less surviving and more kind of, engaging with the world.
Yeah. Well, I now, probably, I don't know how much time I got, but I'd just like to put this thought to you because of my particular bent and my upbringing, you could say, that I feel that so much of our environment has been commercialised and monetised, and that that is actually a disease, that a tremendous amount of what we encounter in our environment through the media, through other people, everywhere we breathe it, is about commerce, about making money, bottom lines, and making your way through life means what sort of job and what's your income and your social status and money terms, blah blah. And I think, personally, that actually has made it a lot harder for people to be sane, and it has accentuated that thing that you said, that people aren't comfortable with themselves, don't value themselves, and as a result they are far more prone to addiction. So, look at the youth today, look at P epidemic, look at the alcohol epidemic, look at the violence epidemic, look at the abuse epidemic. For God's sake, can't someone just stand back and say, well, when's the next? It's just one series of epidemics. You pick your problem, and someone will make a TV program about it, interspersed with ads for various drugs. And I think that society has is really off the rails in that sense, and that is reflected in our heads, and that I'd like to know if you think that's why you encounter a lot of problems in your work. Well, it's not your upbringing, it's not your parents, it's the economy.
Well, it's a real huge question. Of course, before I went to medical school, I was an evolutionary biologist and got into evolution of human social systems and stuff like that, and realized that we have I believe, a very sort of Darwinian motivation to amass resources, to get a stable social situation, to seek out partners, that kind of stuff. And it's very easy for a society to emphasize individualism, and for society to kind of cause a hypertrophy of those selfish tendencies. My suggestion, though, is that if the person, as they in the process of living their life, really stops to think about who they are and what they value, they will, in the process of doing that, begin to see the importance of, for lack of a better word, altruism. Generosity to those around them. They'll feel better about themselves for doing that, and we kind of, one person at a time, begin to erode that movement you're talking about. That is around maximizing your own material success, no matter what the expense. And I think it's hard to go against that when it's so well established. But I think the only individuals who can do that are individuals who know themselves enough to realize that what really matters is that sense of satisfaction with yourself, that comes from, you know, engaging with other people in a positive way. So, God, it sounds so Pollyannish, but I do think it's the only way through this. I don't think, you know, the commercial empire is going to give up its stranglehold on the world voluntarily. There's gonna have to be a kind of revolution, and I think it's a much more intimate process that's gonna have to spur that. You know? So I agree with your original point that sort of self-awareness and self-healing is the starting point, not just for an individual's problems, but ultimately for the societies as well.